Alright, for this video we're going to look at a Form 1040X for an amended U.S. tax return, and in this scenario we have John and Jane taxpayer filing a married joint return, and they need to amend their taxes because they failed to include one of their children as a dependent and qualifying child for the child tax credit. So we've got the full Form 1040X here, which is 2 pages, so we'll cover all of these pieces. And then we do have the amended 1040 to see how we're changing some of the calculations and how that gets reported on the 1040X. We've also got the original 1040 as filed, which omitted that additional dependent. And we have the Form 8812 2023 instructions for the child tax credit. And then lastly, we do have one slide here covering some background on the amended returns and then more details on the fact pattern. Now, the amended returns, when we talk about changing a Form 1040, the amended returns is one method of changing it, but superseded returns are also available. And so we'll talk about the difference here. So when we file an amended return, we are not replacing the original tax filing. We're just correcting for errors or omissions from the previous filing. And in some cases, we're filing to do NOL carrybacks or foreign tax credit carrybacks or maybe a 1256 loss carryback. So amended returns are probably the bulk of the changes that we see. Now, when you file an amended return, they can generally be filed any time, but there are certain statute of limitations that apply. So if you're filing to get a refund, you generally have to file by the later of the 2 dates here. So 3 years from the date you filed your return, or 2 years from the date you paid the tax. If you're filing beyond that window and you're filing to claim a refund, the IRS might deny the claim and they'll just keep the money. Now, superseded tax returns are a little different. So when you file a superseded return, you're replacing the original return completely. So it's almost as if it never happened. Now, there's a bit more of a time constraint here, right? So superseded returns can only be filed after you submitted that original return, but you have to file the superseded return before the original filing deadline or the extended deadline. So if you're filing 2 years after that deadline is passed, superseded isn't going to be available to you. You might still be able to get an amended return in, but superseded is off limits. Now, the fact pattern we have here, we're going to have some additional complications with this Form 1040X, and so we'll talk about that when we look at the form instructions. But in our fact pattern here, we've got John and Jane taxpayer filed a married filing joint return. The couple have 3 children, all under the age of 17. Now, their third child, their daughter Emily, was born December 5th, 2023, so right before the end of the year. Now, when the taxpayers submitted their original tax return in February 2024, they forgot to tell their tax preparer that they had another child, right? This often happens too frequently. Everybody's just kind of rolling forward the data from last year. You forget to add these new things. So the Form 1040 was filed without claiming Emily as a dependent. Now, Emily's Social Security number was issued in January 2024, and this is important because in order to amend your Form 8812 for a child tax credit, the child's SSN has to be issued on or before the tax return's due date. So in other words, you can't apply for the Social Security number 2 years after you submitted the return and then go back and amend it. You have to make the effort to apply for that Social Security number before the return is due. And so we can see some more details in the instructions here. They outline this limitation, right? So if you have a qualifying child that does not have the required SSN, you can't use the child for the child tax credit on an original or amended return, right? So it has to be issued on or before the due date of your 2023 return, including the extensions. Now, what they have said is that if you at least applied for it, an ITIN, that is, if you applied for an ITIN and it was issued after the due date, but you at least submitted that application, then they'll grant you relief. But this is really important, right? So don't wait on applying for that Social Security number for your child. You need to apply as soon as possible in order to make sure that you can claim the credit on your amended return, right? So very, very important. Always. So anytime, the teaching point here is anytime you amend your return, don't just pay attention to the original kind of broad statute of limitations. You have to look at all those other additional elements. So John and Jane are preparing an amended 1040 during June 2024. Now, they didn't file an extension request, so they can't do a superseded return, but they can do an amended return. And that's what we're going to have here. So if we have a look at their original return, we can see quite easily here what they missed, right? So they have 3 children, Alex, Brian, and Emily, but Emily is not reported as a dependent. And so in addition to that, if we scroll down to the Form 8812, credits for qualifying children and other dependents, they're only claiming 2 qualifying children under the age of 17 that have the required Social Security number. So this is what we need to update. So if we look at the 1040X, we have a 1040X for 2023. First and last name of the married couple, so John taxpayer, Jane taxpayer, input the Social Security number for each, and their filing status is married filing jointly. Now, columns A, B, and C are where we input the original numbers, the change, and then the corrected amount. So the original amounts reported in column A, these are simply being pulled from that original tax return. So look at the original tax return and find your adjusted gross income. How many itemized deductions, or did you take the standard deduction? Taxable income. So if we look at the original return, for example, let me go back to page 1. We can see we have our AGI of $128,100, $27,700 of standard deduction, $100, $400 of taxable income, and then the tax. And so we're pulling through all those numbers. Now, the tax liability, $12,643. That tax was calculated using the qualified dividends and capital gains tax worksheet. If you didn't have any qualified dividends or capital gains, then you might have just used the regular federal tax tables. But in our case, the taxpayer does have those types of income, so that's how we calculated that amount of tax. Now, line 7, the non-refundable credits, that $4,000 represents the child tax credit of $2,000 per child for 2 children. So we were able to claim $4,000 of CTC. This is on the original return, so we can see here we've got the Form 8812, $4,000 of credit, but this was not including that additional child tax credit for Emily. All right, so we've got the $4,000, the net amount of tax owed, the total payments that we made from federal withholding, and so on line 18, the overpayment that was made is the original refund amount as shown on the original return. So on our original tax return, when we filed this, we had a refund of $4,857. So that's what we've reported on line 18. Now we have to figure out what are the correct amounts in column C, and then what were the net changes. So the correct amounts here, you'll notice here on lines 1 through 6, none of those values change, right? Because we're not changing any income or deduction items or tax. We're just changing the amount of non-refundable credits that the taxpayer should be entitled to. So AGI, standard deduction, taxable income, tax liability, those amounts remain the same. What we see changes with are line 7. So the amended return here, what we've done on the 8812 is we have now updated the 8812 for 3 qualifying children instead of 2. So now the taxpayer is potentially going to claim $6,000 of credit. Their income of $128,100 falls below the $400,000 filing threshold for married filing joint, so we don't have any phase outs here. And then when we look at the credit limit worksheet, the total amount of tax that the taxpayer owes is $12,643. The amount of credit is well below that, so we are eligible for the full $6,000 of credit. All right. So now, when we look at our line 7 amount, $4,000 was the original, $6,000 is now the new amount of credit that we can claim, so that's a change of $2,000. So the total tax that we owe now is $6,643 instead of $8,643. So when we move on down to line 19 here, we subtract line 18 from line 17, and we're left with $8,643. Now, if the line 11 column C was greater, then it means we owe some additional tax. But in this case, no, we're trying to get a refund because we basically overstated our tax liability. So on line 21, if line 11 column C is less than line 19, which it is, subtract the two, which is $2,000, right? $8,643 minus $6,643 gives us $2,000. So $2,000 is our overpayment, and this is the amount of refund, additional refund that we're going to be able to get. So we've already got $4,857, and we're going to get another $2,000 paid back to us because we've corrected for this issue. Now, in part one, we have to update our dependents. So part one, we list all the dependents for those that were already correctly reported and the new ones. So on line 25 here, we see the original number of dependents reported was 2. We've added an additional dependent, and so the correct number of dependents is 3. We list all the dependents here, even though Alex and Brian were already correctly reported. So we have Alex, Brian, and Emily, social security numbers for each, relationship to the taxpayers, and then their eligibility for either the CTC or the ODC. In this case, all three can get the CTC amounts. And then in part two, we need to explain what happened here, right? So the taxpayers are filing this amended return for 2023. The amended return is correcting the number of dependents and qualifying children for the child tax credit. The taxpayer's daughter, Emily, was born on December 5th, 2023. When the original return was submitted, the taxpayers mistakenly omitted Emily as a dependent and qualifying child on their tax return. So the Form 8812 is updated to reflect 3 qualifying children for the CTC. The total non-refundable child tax credit is increasing from $4,000 to $6,000. All right, so once you've laid out what happened, what was missed, and then attach, I like to attach a copy of the new 1040 and then just put a watermark that says as amended. So the IRS revenue agent that's looking at it can review all the schedules and attachments and make sure that we've included everything as required. And then the taxpayers will both have to sign this, date it, and then go ahead and send it off to the IRS. So that covers it for this tutorial. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below. And as always, I appreciate you watching, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next one. Thank you.